They thought that I would endure forever, that I was too attached to the past, too dependent on their world to leave, but they did not even suspect that this evening would be the last act of the play, where I played the role of a submissive wife, because behind my calmness there was a storm ready to burst and shatter their confidence in his own infallibility. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy watching. My name is Nora Thompson, and tonight, like most evenings since my arrival in Monte Carlo, I found myself sitting alone at a small table in a restaurant located on the edge of the bustling casino square. Behind the thin glass of the showcase, life was bustling. Passers-by strolled leisurely, dressed in expensive suits and evening dresses. Loud laughter could be heard. Flashes of light flashed from cars stopping at the casino entrance. The whole picture reminded me of a mosaic canvas, shimmering with golden hues, but not affecting me personally, as if I remained an observer, and not a part of this world. It was not at all the luxurious life I was born into and which I used to breathe. But after graduating from a fashionable college in stateside, all I wanted to do was just relax, get rid of the sense of predestination that had shadowed me since childhood. My father owns, it seems, half the globe, from hotels to technology companies, and his last name with the letter V at the end opened any doors, but I preferred to use my mother's last name, remaining in the shadows, free from the burden of wealth and influence. The evening was already dying down when the door of the restaurant opened and Daniel, came in. This movement immediately caught my attention, although I immediately chastised myself for my involuntary reaction. He looked like he owned the place, or at least he was sure he could own it. He didn't have the pompous manner that usually accompanies people with money, but everything about his appearance spoke of impeccable taste, honed to perfection. An expensive suit, immaculately fitted, a self-confident gait, a slight smile, as if hinting that he knew in advance how this evening would unfold. He came over to my table, and before I could say anything, he pulled out a chair in front of me, unceremoniously sitting down. "Do you mind if I sit down?" He said it only after he had already sat down, as if there was some meaning in my answer. His smile was all charm, probably perfected to perfection. "It looks like you're already sitting down," I remarked, barely looking up to take a sip of coffee. He grinned, and in that sound there was that unobtrusive confidence that is characteristic of people who are used to getting what they want. "I'm Daniel." "And you're Nora," I said shortly, giving him a quick glance. Not my usual type. Too sophisticated, too perfect. And yet, admittedly, he looked good. "Nora, what brings a girl like you to such an expensive establishment all alone?" There was a slight mockery in his tone, but not rude, but rather playful, exploring. I wasn't sure if I was amused or annoyed. "Just enjoying my coffee," I replied, deliberately leaving the meaning open to interpretation. "What's your excuse?" He tilted his head slightly, as if studying me. I could say business, but today it would be a lie. Let's just say I'm looking for something interesting. And it looks like he found it. I raised an eyebrow. "I hope the coffee meets your expectations." He laughed, and there was something captivating in that laugh, something subtly sincere, despite his obvious acting. Something tells me that he has already surpassed them. I knew he was trying to hook me up. I've seen such men, those who are used to manipulating attention, who know how to control the atmosphere of conversation. But I'm not here to make friends. Definitely not for an affair. "Look, I'm not one of those girls who falls for pretty words," I said, staring at him intently. "And I'm definitely not interested in the game you're playing." "Who says I'm playing?" His voice dropped by half a tone, insinuating and soft. "Experience," I replied shortly. He leaned back in his chair, folded his arms across his chest, and looked at me with interest. "You're cool now." "I'm loving it." An uninvited guest, you start with a greeting, wait for a reaction, then move on to the question. Everything is predictable. The next step is to ask for a phone number or a date. "I'm not looking for a number," he said, and his eyes narrowed a little. "Just a conversation. But if it's too much for you, say the word and I'll disappear. I thought about it. Monte Carlo was beautiful, but lonely. Maybe a little chat wouldn't hurt. The conversation is normal. But let it be easy. We talked for a while, and to my surprise, the conversation really turned out to be easy. He didn't insist on personal details, and I didn't offer them. No attempts to find out who my parents are, how big their fortune is, or what my connections are. There was a certain charm to it. As the night deepened, I realized that despite my initial doubts, I was really enjoying this conversation. Daniel wasn't like the typical men who try to impress me with their wallets or their last names. He had the aura of a man accustomed to elegant things, but not defined by them. Eventually, the evening turned cold, and it was time to go. "Well, Daniel, it was unexpectedly pleasant," I said, getting up. He grinned, peering at me with a slight hint of surprise. "Are you surprised yourself?" I smiled. "Maybe. A little bit. Good night, Daniel." When I returned to my apartment, his words echoed slightly in my mind, making me think that this city, full of bright lights, chance encounters and unexplored possibilities, was really capable of surprises, and maybe even something more. Monte Carlo beckoned, but not because of its luxury and splendor, but because it gave a sense of surprise, a chance to experience a taste of life that was not associated with a surname, responsibilities, or imposed expectations. Maybe, just maybe, I stumbled upon one of those surprises this evening. After that first meeting with Daniel, the evenings in Monte Carlo began to seem a little less lonely, although I would not admit it out loud. He seemed to have some kind of innate ability to appear exactly where I was, but not in the way annoying suitors do, but as if by itself, naturally and unobtrusively, as if the world itself was pushing us to these casual meetings. I would check out the local markets during the day, looking at the spice stalls and fresh baguettes, and suddenly I would spot him in the crowd, with a lazy smile on the corners of his lips, as if he wasn't there for me at all, but also not against keeping company. Or he could end up in the same restaurant when I was having a late dinner alone, not sitting down at my table right away, but just being somewhere nearby, allowing me to decide for myself whether I wanted to be alone or prefer his company. His persistence didn't annoy me, and that surprised me the most. I usually felt instant rejection when someone was too obviously trying to get my attention, but Daniel was able to keep a balance without imposing himself, but also without disappearing completely. Maybe it was because he seemed sincere in his desire to just be around, without ulterior motives, without calculation. One cool evening, when I was sitting on the stone terrace, watching the sun paint the horizon in fiery shades, he came up to me, holding 2 cups of coffee in his hands, and without saying a word, sat next to me, handing me one of them. "Are you suggesting that I want coffee?" I teased, raising an eyebrow slightly. "If I'm wrong, I'll drink both of them," he replied calmly, smiling modestly. "Probably later," I drawled, accepting the cup, from which a warm, bitter aroma immediately rose. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the waves gently crashing against the rocks, filling this moment with a special, almost tangible harmony. At such times, words were superfluous, and he seemed to understand this as well as I did. "You still haven't told me what you're doing in the States," he finally broke the silence, and there was no pressure or curiosity in his voice, just mild interest. I didn't think it mattered, I shrugged, taking a sip. "I'm not working right now. Just enjoying my vacation." "But it's not fair," he remarked, with a slight grin. I looked at him, feeling his gaze studying me, as if he saw something in me that I preferred to ignore. "Everyone has a story, Nora," he added. But I didn't answer, because maybe he was right, or maybe I just didn't want to figure it out right now. Over the next few days, a light routine was established between us, which did not feel like a duty, but brought a strange, unusual sense of comfort. Daniel showed me parts of Monte Carlo that I hadn't known about before, took me into hidden alleys, introduced me to places that weren't marked in guidebooks, and we talked endlessly about everything and nothing, discussing books, movies, and favorite foods. He liked to argue about the best James Bond actor, stubbornly defending Daniel Craig, while I remained true to the classics and stood up for Sean Connery. These conversations were light, without hidden subtexts, without pressure, without commitment, but there was something about them that made me forget about time. One day, when we were walking along the beach, he suddenly stopped abruptly, his gaze became serious, and something appeared in him that I hadn't seen in him before. "Nora," his voice was a little quieter than usual, as if he chose his words carefully. "I know, I'm just some guy you met at a coffee shop. But these last weeks, they got better because of you." I stopped too, not knowing how to react. Feelings are not what I planned to deal with on this trip. "Daniel, I like spending time with you, yes. But it's just a break for me. I'm not looking for complications." He nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. "I understand. No pressure. Just know that I'm here." "All right. And I think you're pretty amazing." The days turned into weeks, and my time in Monte Carlo was gradually coming to an end. We spent more and more time together, and what started as casual meetings and light conversations now turned into late dinners and early breakfasts. It was the last thing I expected, to fall in love with someone under the stars of the Mediterranean, but there was no point in denying it anymore. And then, one of those nights, he suddenly said something that stunned me. "Come back with me, Nora. Work for my company in the States." I stared at him, trying to figure out if he was serious. "I know it's sudden," he continued, looking at me almost anxiously. "But I don't know. I just think it might be great." The idea was crazy, completely insane. And yet, there was a part of me that was tempted. Tempted by adventure. Tempted by the idea of taking this, whatever it is, and seeing where it leads. Moving back to the States was like stepping into an alternate universe, where my usual life with its chaotic decisions, random encounters, and freedoms suddenly transformed into something more structured, orderly, and maybe even predictable. Daniel's offer was not just a job, it was an invitation into his life, an opportunity to become a part of his world, the very world where there was no place for secrets and innuendos, but at the same time it seemed calm, reliable, filled with warmth and those quiet moments that I began to appreciate. And now I was living in an ordinary apartment, in an ordinary part of the city, among ordinary people, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like someone who didn't have to live up to expectations or maintain other people's illusions about themselves. I played the role of an ordinary girl who was lucky, and not only with a job, but also with a man who looked at me as if I didn't have a complicated past, a family name that carried the weight of influence, or a world in which money and power determined everything. However, my father had other views on the ordinary. He didn't believe in illusions and knew me better than anyone else. One afternoon, when I was unpacking the last box, trying to arrange the books on the shelves so as to create a sense of comfort, he appeared in the doorway, tall, still confident, with that unchanging bearing of a man accustomed to control much more than just his emotions. His booming laughter suddenly filled my small living room, vibrating in the air with the vibration of something familiar, almost nostalgic. "Nora, you're hiding in plain sight, huh?" he grinned, and before I could say anything, he hugged me tightly, so it was hard to breathe for a moment, but there was so much warmth in that hug that I couldn't help but smile. "So, tell me about this decision," he said, finally releasing me, and there was something in his gaze that betrayed not just curiosity, but rather the wariness he always had when it came to things important to me. "This guy. It must be something really special, since you just moved in like that." His tone was light, almost joking, but I knew he was really just testing the ground, doing his duty as a father, sniffing out any possible problems I might be trying to hide. I sighed, sat down on the couch, and thought about how best to respond. "His name is Daniel," I began, choosing my words. "He's different, Dad. He doesn't know anything about all this." I waved my hand vaguely, hinting not only at the money, but also at all the complicated connections that were inevitably connected with it. My father sat down next to me, his expression became more serious, and at that moment he looked even stricter than usual. "Nora, You know you can't keep this a secret forever, he said softly but firmly. If he's going to be a part of your life, he needs to know who you are. I nodded, knowing full well that he was right, but the thought made me uncomfortable. I know, Dad, I admitted, looking down. It's just, I want to be sure of him before I complicate the situation. He watched me in silence for several long seconds, and then, as if deciding that he had said enough for today, he simply ruffled my hair, as he used to do when I was a child. Always, baby, he smiled. And just remember, if you need anything, I'm just one call away. And I have eyes everywhere. He winked, and although his words could have been mistaken for a joke, I knew there was more truth in them than I would have liked. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of adaptation to a new job, a new life, new rhythms that gradually intertwined into my existence, becoming familiar. Daniel was constant, supportive, and still as charming as ever, but now there was something about him that hadn't been there before, a kind of new hardness, a kind of sharpness that came with the responsibilities he carried. He didn't put pressure on me, he didn't try to introduce me into his life too quickly, but I felt that he was waiting for something important. And one evening, when we were sitting over a quiet dinner at my house, there was tension between us, which I felt even before he uttered his next words. Nora, he began, putting down his fork and looking at me intently, when do you think I'll meet your parents? I froze, feeling the words freeze in my throat. I feel like I'm missing out on a lot of your life, he added, his voice soft but with a hint of uncertainty. I looked away, the weight of the moment pressing down on me, forcing me to remember everything I had been avoiding for so long. I swallowed, choosing my words. My mother died a long time ago. And my dad, he's just an ordinary trucker, and we're not really talking right now. Daniel frowned, and a shadow of concern crossed his face. I'm sorry to hear that, he said softly. But you know, when you're ready, I'd like to meet him. Family is important. I nodded, appreciating his sincerity, but knowing full well that my father's world and Daniel's were two incompatible spaces that could destroy too much. And I wasn't ready for these worlds to cross yet. Life with Daniel was moving at a pace I never expected. We've already mixed up our lives, even if we didn't say it out loud. My work at his company was going great, and our relationship was getting deeper, more meaningful, and more real. I thought we had more time, that we could continue like this without asking unnecessary questions, without rushing the inevitable. I think it looked like we were preparing for something big. But even realizing this, I was still stunned when this big moment really happened. It was an ordinary evening, one of those that merge into a series of weekdays when fatigue accumulates, but the presence of a loved one makes everything around warmer and more comfortable. We were at his house, in a spacious but not cold luxury apartment, the windows of which opened a fascinating view of the night city landscape, where neon lights broke through the darkness, drawing intricate patterns on the glass. We had just had dinner, and although there were not delicious dishes on the table, but simple takeaway food, it did not matter, because the evening was filled with a special calm, the very closeness that is born in silence between two people who understand each other without words. We were sitting on the couch, with majestic silhouettes of whales slowly gliding across the screen in the background, disappearing into the depths of the ocean, but we didn't watch the movie, we just let its measured rhythm become the background for our thoughts. Daniel turned to me, and I immediately felt a change in his mood. His gaze became more focused, serious than the relaxed atmosphere required, and before I could ask what was bothering him, he took my hand, the warmth of his palm instantly spread through my body, causing a slight tremor, and my heart betrayed it began to beat faster, as if anticipating something important. Nora, his voice was soft, but there was a firmness in it that emphasized the importance of the upcoming conversation. I've been thinking about us, about everything we've been through, and about everything I want for us in the future. I nodded, feeling my mouth go dry from the tension that gripped me, because there was more to these words than just thinking. Yes, I breathed, unable to say anything more meaningful. I love you, Nora, he continued, his voice deepening, and there was something in those words that made me believe it wasn't just a confession, but a promise. I love everything about you and I don't want to imagine my life without you." He paused, and I noticed how he swallowed, as if gathering his courage before saying the most important thing. "I want to be with you always. Will you marry me?" Just like that, without formalities, without getting down on one knee theatrically, without a pre-prepared ring box. Everything is simple, straightforward, and sincere, as it was natural in our case. Daniel. My name came out of my mouth almost in a whisper. My heart was pounding, and without thinking for another second, I said the only word that mattered at that moment: yes. It came out of me rather hastily, almost with relief, as if I had finally allowed myself to accept what I wanted, but was afraid to realize. "Yes, I will." He smiled, the same wide, infectious smile that had won me over on the first day, and before I could say anything else, he hugged me tightly, so that for a moment I couldn't breathe, but I didn't care, because at that moment there was no past, no future, just us. We spent the rest of the evening discussing our future, sharing dreams, making plans that seemed like more than just words, because they belonged to both of us. It was exciting and a little scary, but at the same time it felt right. However, the next challenge was that I had to break the news to my father. I expected him to be happy, maybe even genuinely happy for me, but his response was sluggish at best. "Nora," his voice was flat, but I could hear the faintest hint of alarm in it. "You know I want nothing but your happiness, but are you sure about this? Everything happens so fast." I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts, and tried to speak with confidence, which I didn't really have. "I'm sure, Dad. He's a great guy. You'll see." He looked at me for a long, searching moment, as if trying to see into my soul and see if I was kidding myself. "Okay," he said after a long pause, but I felt like he was saying it more for my sake than out of his own peace of mind. "But promise me you'll sign the prenup. Just in case." The word prenuptial agreement did not cause me surprise or fear. It was just another part of the modern marriage package, especially when it came to people who had as much to lose as I did. Even if Daniel didn't know the extent of it. "Of course, Dad. We'll be fine," I assured him, trying to make my voice light. "Then, okay," he paused, and there was something in his gaze that I couldn't decipher. "But, Nora, I won't be at the wedding." I opened my mouth to say something, but he raised his hand, stopping me. "I don't want to spoil your story about how you are a simple girl." It hurt to hear that, but I understood his logic. And then came the introduction to Daniel's mother. Her reception was icy from the start, and dinner at their family home turned into an ordeal I hadn't expected. "Daniel, are you sure about this girl?" Her tone was as cold as her gaze, piercing right through me. "She doesn't seem suitable for our family." I saw Daniel tense up, and his fingers tightened around my palm, but he tried to smooth things over. "Mom." "The prenuptial agreement is non-negotiable," she interrupted, without taking her eyes off me appraisingly. I didn't hesitate for a second. "Absolutely. I wouldn't want it to be any other way," I said when we later formalized the terms in the presence of a lawyer. Despite all these obstacles, our wedding in the Maldives was exciting. Standing next to Daniel, feeling the light sea breeze, listening to the ocean whisper something ancient and eternal to us, feeling the warm sand under my feet, I realized that this moment belongs only to us. And even though everything that happened before had left its mark, now I felt a surge of hope. It was just us, our love, and the future we were ready to build together. Despite a difficult start due to family expectations, our married life began better than I could have hoped. Daniel and I settled into a new house, spacious, flooded with light, with high ceilings and panoramic windows overlooking the green garden, which we both imagined as a symbol of our future full of harmony and happiness. There was more space here than we could ever need, but it inspired a sense of stability, security, and a new phase that was supposed to be the beginning of our ideal life together. I plunged back into my work, determined to prove, not only to others, but also to myself, that I am much more than just the boss's wife, that my professional value is not determined by my last name or marriage, but solely by my competencies, experience, and diligence. My role in the company has always been difficult, but now it has an additional layer of expectations, pressure, and hidden views that evaluate my every decision from a different angle. Now I was not only a manager of large projects, but also part of key decision-making processes, and my every word, every step was subjected to an unconscious comparison with Daniel. At first, he seemed proud, even inspired by my successes, and I saw his eyes flash with pride when he introduced me to colleagues and partners at meetings, emphasizing my status not only as his wife, but also as a person whose professional achievements deserve respect. "This is Nora, my wife and our project manager," he said with a slight smile, and there was something warm in his voice, as if he was proud that we were a team, that we were stronger together. But as the months passed, and the projects I supervised became more successful, bringing significant profits and increasing the company's prestige, something changed in Daniel. At first, it was barely noticeable, a short comment said in passing, an insignificant remark that could have been mistaken for a simple joke, but gradually something began to slip into his words that made me wary. One evening, when we were sitting down to dinner, and the warm scent of spicy spices was in the air, he suddenly brought up the subject. "Nora, you're doing great at work. Maybe even too good," he said, looking down at his plate and idly moving a piece of fish with his fork, as if he didn't dare look me in the eye. I raised my head, looked at him with a puzzled expression, and, trying not to attach importance to the strange intonation, I calmly asked, "What do you mean?" "Too good, isn't that great for company?" He looked at his plate for a long time, as if choosing his words carefully, and finally sighed. "Of course, but, you know, the guys are starting to say." He glanced at me briefly before looking away again, "that it's turning into, Nora, show it there, Nora, solve it here." I felt something uncomfortably constrict inside, but not wanting to jump to conclusions, I tried to remain calm. "So what? Isn't it great that we're doing well?" Daniel pursed his lips a little, as if he was going to say something else, but changed his mind. "I'm happy, but it's just too much. You know, everyone is always talking about you, about how you handle everything. It makes me wonder where I am in all this." This conversation was the first of many. The tension between us grew with the success of the business, and if Daniel had previously enthusiastically supported my professional achievements, now his behavior was increasingly tinged with hidden resentment, irritation, and some inner discomfort that he could not or did not want to express openly. The situation only worsened when his mother came to us and decided to spend a few weeks with us. Her presence in the house brought with it the ghost of old-fashioned traditional values that I had always managed to avoid, but which, as it turned out, were deeply rooted in her idea of family life. She did not make harsh statements, did not make scenes, but her words, thrown casually, careless remarks, as if accidental, but in fact carefully calibrated, penetrated deeply, leaving behind an unpleasant aftertaste. "You're always in the office, Nora," she said with a slight reproach in her voice when I was going to a meeting once again. "When do you have time to take care of your husband?" I tried to dismiss these words, telling myself that it didn't matter, that her opinion didn't matter, but her remarks, dripping on Daniel day after day like poison, did their job, deepening the rift between us. No amount of success at work could compensate for what was slowly falling apart at home. The more I achieved, the more our marriage suffered, and one evening, returning from work, Daniel said something I did not expect to hear. He entered the living room, and I immediately noticed that his face was gloomy and his movements were tense, as if he had been preparing for this conversation for a long time. "Nora," his voice was flat, but there was a steely edge to it that made me wary. "I think it would be better if you left the company." I turned abruptly to him, not immediately realizing the meaning of what he had said, and then, when his words reached me, I felt everything go cold inside. "What?" I blinked, hoping I'd misheard. "We need to focus on our family," he continued, avoiding my gaze, "and it seems that your role in the company is just causing too much tension." I stared at him, unable to believe that these words were coming from a man who had once encouraged me to actively participate in business, was proud of my successes, and supported me. "Leave the company?" I repeated slowly, trying to keep my voice from trembling. But why? I contribute so much. There was something in his gaze, a shadow of fatigue, irritation, maybe even disappointment, but he just shrugged his shoulders, as if he didn't understand why I was questioning his words at all. It's for the best. His voice was calm, but it lacked the confidence I was used to hearing. You can focus on the house, maybe, start that garden you always talked about. I looked at him, and it seemed to me that the air in the room suddenly became heavy, viscous, impenetrable, and his words, spoken in such a dismissive tone, as if it were not about my career, not about what I had been building for years, but about something insignificant, empty, not worth attention. They echoed in my head. The next day, waking up earlier than usual, I went downstairs, feeling a strange silence that enveloped the house like a dense morning fog, and immediately noticed that something had changed. There was no familiar aroma of freshly brewed coffee. There were no muffled footsteps of the housekeeper setting out breakfast. No one watered the plants in the garden and did not carry their fresh flowers in the rooms, which decorated our house every morning. Everything was strangely empty, motionless, as if the house itself was holding its breath in anticipation of something inevitable. Confused, I went to Daniel's office, hoping to get an explanation, and found him there, calmly looking through some papers, as if nothing had happened, as if all this was just a figment of my imagination. "Where is everyone?" I asked, trying to stay calm, even though anxiety was already beginning to boil inside. He didn't even look up, idly flipping through the documents, and then, as if he had just remembered my presence, he said indifferently, "I fired all our domestic workers." The world rocked. "You, what?" It took me a moment to realize the meaning of what was said, and when I did, I felt my stomach tighten with indignation. "Housekeepers, cooks, gardeners," he shrugged, as if it were something insignificant, not worth discussing. "It's all on you now. You wanted to do more housework, here's your chance." There was no hint of sympathy in his voice, no trace of his former concern, just a cold, almost contemptuous detachment, as if he were playing out a pre-prepared performance in which I was given the role of an obedient wife, accepting his decisions without a murmur. I wasn't afraid of housework, I never was, but the way it was presented to me seemed cruel and unfair, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the man I married, not the loving and caring man I knew, but someone the other one is alien, cold, intolerant, and controlling. His mother, who was living with us at the time and seemed to enjoy every moment of this farce, just grinned, her eyes flashing with triumph when she heard her son's words. "It's good for a wife to focus on her home," she said with forced gentleness, but there was undisguised joy in her voice, as if she had finally achieved her goal. Whenever Daniel talked about my new role as a full-time housewife, she nodded approvingly, pursed her lips, as if holding back another sarcastic comment, but her look spoke for itself. That's how it should be. While I was trying to adjust to this sudden, imposed turn in my life, I couldn't help but feel a gnawing sense of shame. Shame for not anticipating this, shame for not heeding the warnings of my father, who had doubted Daniel from the very beginning, shame for allowing myself to be driven into the trap. When Daniel suggested that we go to Monte Carlo to maybe rekindle the spark in our relationship, I hesitated, but deep down I desperately hoped that this would really help us regain what we had lost. However, hope faded as quickly as it had flared up when his mother announced without a shadow of a doubt that she would come with us. "It's been many years since I've traveled," she said loudly, as if it wasn't a suggestion, but a royal decree that no one dared to object to. Daniel, of course, welcomed her with open arms, without even thinking about how I might feel about it. We rented a small house in Monte Carlo, charming but expensive, overlooking the azure expanse of the sea, with luxurious interiors and a terrace where I imagined quiet evenings with a glass of wine and long conversations. But this house quickly became not a refuge for me, but a prison. From the very beginning, Daniel and his mother saw the city as their personal playground. They rented expensive cars, spent their days in exclusive boutiques, dined at the best restaurants, while I was left to manage the household, acting as a servant in my own house. They demanded homemade food, expecting me to cook for them, clean, serve their whims, while they wandered around the city enjoying a life from which I was gradually excluded. Every day Daniel's mother became more and more sarcastic, her tone became more and more venomous, and one day, at dinner, she made a particularly cruel remark. Actually, Nora, her voice was sweet, but there was outright mockery in it. Living at someone else's expense must be a hell of a life, huh? She sneered contemptuously. Her words were a slap in the face disguised as an innocent grin, but the pain from her burned no less than if she had actually hit me. Daniel didn't protect me. He didn't say a word. On the contrary, he grinned, and his laughter became a betrayal for me, an echo that reverberated through the cold walls of our temporary home. I felt isolated, trapped in a cage from which I could not find a way out, and the urban splendor, all this pretentious luxury of Monte Carlo, shimmered around us, seemed like a muted shadow of their contempt, their condescending pity. One evening, as we drove past a large old hotel, its facade reminded me of a world that had once been close to me, a world of elegance, dignity, and respect that I no longer felt in my life. Daniel's mother, her voice filled with envious contempt, snorted. Lucky billionaire Harris. Imagine that he owns a hotel like this. Ruling such a palace. That night at dinner, sitting in a restaurant overlooking the sea, I felt the last remnants of my patience crumble to dust when, with an imperious wave of her wrist, she called the waiter over and loudly declared, "For Nora, the cheapest dish will do. No need to spoil her with excesses she doesn't deserve." She spoke loudly enough for the neighboring tables to hear, and I saw several pairs of eyes slide in our direction, but what struck me most was Daniel's response, a short laugh in which there was not a drop of disagreement. "That's a good call, Mom," he grinned, giving me an indifferent look. And then he added, with a lazy wave of his hand to the waiter, "Let's not overdo it." Humiliation washed over me like powerful sea waves crashing against the rocks below us, mercilessly grinding the stone for years, as this situation sharpened my soul, leaving deep, invisible cracks in it. The crash of my chair, which I abruptly pushed back as I got up, echoed off the walls of the restaurant, as if emphasizing the depth of my confusion, and there was more determination in that sound than I felt at that moment. I turned to both of them, to the man I once loved, and to the woman who had done everything from day one to make me feel insignificant. "I'm not going to take this anymore." My voice was flat, but there was a strength in it that I hadn't realized I had until that moment. It was louder than I had intended, and for a moment the restaurant became quieter, as if the people around me sensed that something important was about to happen. I clenched my hands into fists to stop shaking, but my resolve was unshakable. "I'm divorcing you, Daniel." I saw him blink, not immediately realizing the meaning of my words, and then his face froze, turning into a mask of icy contempt. The cold Monte Carlo air that tickled my heated skin was nothing compared to the chill of betrayal that I felt when I left the restaurant without turning around, knowing that I was leaving behind not only this evening, but an entire chapter of my life. But instead of apologizing or at least letting me leave with dignity, Daniel and his mother ran after me, their footsteps sounding like hammer blows on the pavement. "Do you really think you can just walk away like that?" His voice rang with sarcasm, and anger flashed in his eyes. "Just look at her," his mother's sharp and cold voice filled with disdain rang out. "A beggar, unworthy of my son." My heart started beating faster, but I didn't let myself stop. I wanted to run as far away from their poisonous words as possible, but before I could leave, Daniel caught up with me and grabbed my purse, roughly ripping it off my shoulder. "It's my money, Nora." His fingers tightened on the strap. "Go get out on all fours if you need to." His voice was laced with contempt, each syllable hitting me like a whip, leaving invisible wounds. He yanked my purse so hard that I staggered, stumbling on the smooth pavement, but I held on, suppressing the urge to burst into an angry scream. Next to him, his mother laughed, a clear, venomous sound, her eyes sparkling with malicious triumph. "Maybe now you'll learn how to beg in Monte Carlo." Her words dripped venom, penetrating me, "because that's all you're good for." Their laughter echoed down the street, sounding like a mockery of my whole life, of the years I devoted to this marriage, of the love I once felt. I stood there, among the shadows of the streetlights, realizing that I was alone, without money, without support, but with an unyielding desire never to let them break me again. But at the moment when their last insults were disappearing into the evening air, fate intervened, as if reminding me that the world is much wider than the narrow framework into which they tried to drive me. We were at the same big old hotel, the facade of which I had glimpsed earlier, the one that Daniel's mother was so jealous of, with an undisguised desire to own such a place. Pointing to its majestic doors, she sneered again. "Maybe they'll let you in like a beggar." But before I could answer, the massive gates of the hotel suddenly swung open, and a tall man in an immaculate security guard uniform stepped out. He stopped, looked around the street, and then his gaze fell on me. Recognition lit up his face. "Miss Harris." He called warmly, his voice dripping with respect as he quickly approached me with a slight bow. The moment he said my name, the air around us seemed to change, as if it was difficult to breathe from exertion. Daniel and his mother froze, their smug expressions turning to confusion and then outright shock. The guard smiled broadly. "Your father informed us that you can come in at any time. Please come in." I noticed his gaze flick briefly over Daniel and his mother, but it didn't have the contempt they'd given me all these months, just a slight puzzlement, as if he genuinely didn't understand why they were standing next to me instead of behind me like servants. "The best room is always reserved for you, Miss Harris, as per Mr. Harris's instructions." Daniel's mother's face paled, her lips parted, but not a single word escaped them. "Harris?" Finally, she said in a strangled voice. "Like in Billionaire Harris?" She faltered, her earlier bravado crumbling to dust like a house of cards destroyed by a sudden gust of wind. I didn't look at her, I didn't enjoy her defeat, I didn't explain anything. I just stepped forward, my posture straightened, and my voice was calm as I said, "Thank you, Pierre." A sense of relief spread inside me, a sense of justice that I had been searching for so long, but dared not hope to find. Behind me, Daniel swallowed convulsively, his voice becoming a pathetic semblance of his former confidence. "Nora, please," he said with a desperation I hadn't heard in his voice before. "I didn't mean to." His mother, hurriedly regaining her composure, stepped forward, reaching out her hand as if she was going to touch my shoulder, but she didn't dare. "Can we at least go in for a drink?" "What is it?" she asked with a forced smile, which still harbored the hope of salvation. I didn't answer. Without looking back, I entered the hotel, and the doors closed behind me with a soft but final sound, separating me from the chaos I had left behind. Pierre led me to the front desk, where the staff greeted me with a respect I hadn't felt in too long, a respect that belonged not to Daniel's wife, not to a woman who had been humiliated, but to the daughter of their employer, a man who could choose his own fate. The flight back to the United States was long, almost endless, and it gave me a lot of time to reflect not only on my past, but also on how I want to see my future, set priorities, realize what I really want and what I will never let anyone do to me again. I spent long hours in silence, looking out the window at the endless sea below, and when the plane finally touched down, my resolve strengthened, like city sidewalks, solid, ready to withstand any pressure, but not yielding to it. The next day, without delay, I found myself in the office of one of the most respected lawyers in the city. A spacious office with a massive oak desk, dim lights, austere leather armchairs, the smell of expensive coffee and paper. All this was created in order to inspire confidence in clients, but I was not a confused victim who came for salvation. No, I was a woman who knew what she wanted and intended to get it. In front of me, neatly laid out like a carefully thought-out battle map, were documents that reflected the history of my work, my achievements, and my injustice. "During your time at the company," the lawyer leaned back in his chair and looked at me carefully over the top of his glasses, "your husband did not pay you the bonuses due for the multimillion-dollar deals that you concluded." His tone was a mixture of surprise and restrained indignation, as if he could not believe that such a thing could happen, but he knew that it was not uncommon in a world of injustice. "That sounds like the right thing to do," I said, stifling a bitter laugh. Countless hours that I had invested in the company flashed before my eyes, not noticing how every day I was becoming not just Daniel's wife, but a real driving force behind his business. All the deals he signed were possible thanks to my hard work, my negotiations, my decisions. But now that I was no longer a part of his life, he decided to erase me from the company's history. "We're suing," the lawyer said decisively, "for $3 million. The courtroom was cold and sterile, and every detail in it seemed to remind me of strict, impartial justice. But the heated glances that Daniel cast at me from across the room betrayed his intensity of emotions. He stood there, fumbling through his defenses, desperately trying to explain himself, to justify himself, to dodge. But all I saw in front of me was the pathetic man who had once seemed unshakable to me. When the verdict was delivered, it sounded loud and solemn, like the final chord in a symphony of my victory. The court recognized my right, and I was awarded $3 million. Daniel didn't wait for everyone to leave. At the courthouse, he rushed to me, as if this scene could still end differently, as if he had at least one trump card left. "Nora," his voice was shaking, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. "Everyone's laughing at me. I screwed up. Can we start over?" Once, perhaps, his words would have touched me, strained old heartstrings, made me think, but that time has passed. He didn't miss me, he couldn't bear to be defeated, ridiculed, he needed to regain control, but he no longer had power over me. "You're just missing out on money, Daniel," my voice was as hard as metal. "Maybe next time, listen less to your mom." The sharpness of my words cut through the air like a blade, but I didn't wait for an answer. I just turned and left, and the sound of my heels, clear, rhythmic, echoed along the sidewalk, marking the end of this chapter. When I returned home, I ran into my father. He stood in the doorway, his gaze heavy, full of questions that we were both afraid to ask. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, but I couldn't delay this moment any longer. "Dad," I breathed in, gathering my courage, "I should have listened to you." I expected reproaches, but instead he just wrapped me in his arms, warm, forgiving, as if sheltering me from all the pain I had to go through. "Now you should have learned by yourself," he said softly, but confidently. "And knowledge is half the battle." We talked late into the night, discussing the mistakes we made in life, new beginnings, and the importance of not being afraid to build your future despite the defeats you've suffered. His words became a beacon for me, illuminating the way forward, and I realized that my journey was just beginning. Inspired by this conversation, I began laying the groundwork for my next venture. My experience at Daniel's company not only honed my skills, but also ignited my passion for the industry, a passion I couldn't ignore. And now I knew that I wanted to create something of my own. I decided to open my own investment firm. Using not only my experience, but also a solid financial agreement that I received through the court, I had all the resources to start something meaningful. I understood that this path would not be easy, but now I had the main thing: freedom. Weeks turned into months as I built my business from scratch, paving the way for a new life step by step. The difficulties were daunting, every day brought new challenges, but I learned, every obstacle made me stronger, every failure taught me a new lesson, every success proved that I was on the right track. And so, sitting in my new office, looking at the noisy streets below, at people rushing to their dreams, I realized how far I had come, from a disappointed wife lost in a loveless marriage to a competent business owner, a strong woman who would never allow herself to be someone's shadow again. It was a long and difficult journey, but it got me to where I needed to be. And that was just the beginning.